So, alchemical doctrines, they've been mysterious to mankind, except for the select few for as long as we've been recording history. We can trace the origins of alchemy, so to speak, back to Egypt, but it seems as if this is an archetype that is quite a bit older than we might suspect. There'll be no reasons for me here to get into the history and the black and white facts about alchemical transmutation, because those are things you can look up anywhere online or get yourself a book. But what I would like to do is talk about what is not talked about, making these connections. I would like to express how I feel alchemical transmutation can practically work within this world and within your life. How can we apply the concepts of alchemy to ourselves? Knowing that the alchemical process of turning base metals into gold is a metaphor that represents turning an unfortunate situation into profit, or a mundane state of being into a form of thriving. So right off the bat with alchemy, we know that the language of it is not literal, but in fact symbolic, and in many cases allegorical. To say that the first rule of alchemy goes as such: man cannot gain anything without first giving something in return. To obtain something of equal value, something of equal value must be lost. That is alchemy's first law of equivalent exchange. So let's keep that in mind later as we dive into the practicalities of transmutation. The four pillars of alchemy seem to be philosophy, astronomy, alchemy, and virtue. The last of which, virtue, is not only the most important, but should actually reside within the alchemist from the time of his awakening, his transmutation that is, to death. And that is the only way to solidify his work, is to maintain that virtue throughout his entire career until he dies. Symbols reused throughout time and prehistory speak not to our conscious thinking mind, but to our primordial self, the driving factor of all human beings. After all, the definition of using language is strictly attuned to something's limitations within nature. To name something is to negate it to our finite aspect of perception. Symbols like the Ouroboros seem to represent infinity or cycles. To me, the cross seems to symbolize the adjacent factors of action and righteousness. The Hamza hand, the Eye of Horus, the all-seeing eye within the triangle or pyramid, the idea of human forms with animal heads, all the way back to sacred geometry and sigils. They are meant to represent a concept within the context of their teaching. They have different meanings to each viewer and change and evolve in meaning per teaching and according to where the student is in his path and relevant to the doctrine in which it resides. The alchemical symbol of lead being tormented into gold by sulfur is a perfect example of something that is too complex or personal to be spoken outright. Just by witnessing the symbol, though, and this symbology, a part of the self is triggered. It begins to learn something about itself and its place within the world. Old stories and legends or myths exhibit the same concept. Instead of taking a myth as a story that literally happened, imagine it as part of yourself, your own psychological characters at work. Stories like the Sword of Excalibur, the tale of Cain and Abel, the Knights of Camelot searching for the Holy Grail, the temptation of the Garden of Eden, the birth of the original Buddha, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the list goes on. In one of those particular myths, for example, the Knights of Camelot and their search for the Holy Grail, there is a gem of wisdom beneath the surface of the story that it pursues the idea of darkness leading into light. The king orders his knights to find the darkest portion of the forest outside of the castle walls, far away from the comforts of shelter. Each knight finds their own path of the forest that to them seems to be the darkest and searches that place for the grail. When they return, there are multiple holy grails that have been found by the knights and brought to the king. The perfect metaphor symbolizes the practice of looking within to the parts of our mind that we don't find and pleasing. Becoming comfortable with those portions of our mind and thus finding a deeper truth than we could have thought possible by seeking pleasures and comfort, we then take what we have learned and turn it over to a higher power of sorts that composes a membrane of nature to the newest and highest standards achieved by the seeker while in the dark. These stories are meant to excite the purpose specific to our own lives. Think of the characters as aspects of your own psychological elements and opposing forces. We learn from the stories and symbols through a collected consciousness. They're not merely for entertainment purposes, but also to shake loose parts of the specific persona. Through them, we can gain a vision of what all human beings go through as a collective unit. For example, in Hindu texts, there can be a lot of confusion because there seems to be a lot of gods. And once we kind of realize that, as opposed to being creators of all, as we seem to depict gods as, they were more personifications of ideas. The Brahma, a precursor of Shiva, has 4 faces representing the 4 cardinal directions. Brahma is sitting on a lotus sprouting from the navel of Vishnu and dreams of realities. We, that is, our world, are within the dreams of the Brahma. When he ceases dreaming, we cease to exist, creating another great cycle of death and rebirth. The parable here can be interpreted in many different ways. I can't help but think of our technological age. This sounds a lot like turning on a computer, using its software to create, letting work come to fruit, exporting the work, and then turning off the computer. There's a cycle there. Could there be a connection at all between what was just described and this story of Vishnu and Brahma? Might these old stories describe our own source of reality in ways that we can understand in our culture's unique time and understanding with the limited animal brain that we have? This idea bears the fruit of a concept with a matrix of reality, or an accidental reality as created by the Gnostic demiurge. But scientists today are even speculating that we may live in some sort of simulation. This could be what the Hindu creation story is hinting at. There's creation stories of all ages and all parts of the world that have quite similar themes. The image of the serpent rings loud in every culture throughout time and in different ways. One of the most widespread versions of the symbol of the serpent is the idea of overcoming fear. To this day, our collective mind is programmed to fear snakes. Is this just because they look strange and have teeth? Or is there maybe more to this? If we go back as far as humans can possibly go in our evolution on Earth, there is one thing we have always encountered: the serpent. Think about the predators we faced in more primal times: large cats, birds of prey, deep sea animals, crocodiles. If you want to escape the feline, you go into the water. If you want to escape the crocodile, you can climb into a tree. If you seek to escape the paisaw or the giant birds of prey, you can go into a cave. But in none of these places of refuge can you hide from the serpent. It'll be there. So the only way to overcome this threat is to face it head on. We would have to protect ourselves and our young from these eaters of men. And although large cats are absolutely killing machines, in every case the prey must flee, except for in the case of the serpent. He is there waiting for you. You are now obligated to fight. So it's really no wonder that there are so many myths that involve going through the serpent or slaying the dragon. There are tales of men who must climb a tower to get to the beautiful maiden, but there is a dragon guarding the only way up. There are tales of seeking hidden treasure in the back of a cave, which is guarded, of course, by some form of a serpent. And both the tower and the cave allegories, there's no way around the snake. You cannot tiptoe past it. You cannot slip in the back undetected. You are, in a way, destined to slay the dragon. Think for a moment about what it is in your world that can be represented by this serpent. Now think, what is your treasure behind it? What is your sword to slay the dragon? We can use these myths as learning devices about ourselves, our place and our purpose in the world. The serpent also appears a likeness to all things temporary. The snake, like the alchemical symbol of the waning moon, sheds its skin and is renewed. Everything in our physical world is temporary, but lit up by a life force of some kind, and that is the only thing that is permanent. The snake leaves his skin behind and transforms through the light that can be symbolized by the reflection of the light of the sun that makes the cycles of the moon possible. Therefore, representing that main prana, that life force, the only thing consistent, the only thing unchanging, the only thing not temporary. It's still recording. My buddy Jung is quoted as saying, "Inasmuch as the serpent leads into the shadows, it has the function of the anima. It leads you into the depths. It connects the above and the below." Of course, you might know that Carl is famed for saying that for the leaves to grow to heaven, the roots must in turn grow to hell. Something like that. You get the idea. You don't get those leaves and fruits for free. You gotta go down in the muck, down in the dirt, in the cold. Jung seemed to characterize some of these symbols as archetypes. For example, there is the archetype of the trickster and the hero. The archetype of the trickster seems to arise many times within our mythology. In whatever form that the trickster chooses to intervene according to the specific culture, there are common traits within all of the lore. The most famous form we have in pop culture today is that of the Honest John from the story of Pinocchio. But this being goes back to the very depths of pre-recorded history and is truly a part of who we are today. The trickster takes advantage of the part of the human psyche that has not yet broken free from the animal nature. It sees the parts of us that are still attached to the needs of the body and desire and use those against us, either as a prank or maybe something more sinister. The trickster knows that you have fears, burdens, and desires and uses them against you effortlessly. It needs no weapons in hand. It knows that you are already holding the weapon in your own hand, but without the intent to slay yourself. This is why the trickster is considered to be at play, as opposed to being evil. He uses his wit and charm instead of force in order to effortlessly manipulate a person or situation for his own entertainment or for more sinister reasons. This trickster entity, like the demon called Mara, can be overcome by simply recognizing our weakness to it, and thus seeing it for what it really is, past its current disguise. Can you think of anything within your own life that can be represented by the archetype of the trickster? What can you see in yourself that can be played as a fool by this entity? Now, what can you do to dissolve this sort of cosmic prank? The wisdom of the ancient people obviously has little to no scientific terminology that resembles ours of today, any more than we can currently use symbology and an image to convey our theories and knowledge through words. Is it possible that, much like how we struggle with evolution and creation as two different things, but start to lean in the idea that they might be the same thing, called by two different mouth noises, that we are indeed speaking of the same themes, but with a completely different cultural point of view? Today, when studying the human anatomy of the nervous system and the brain, we use language to refer to these items such as the pineal gland, pituitary gland, the sensor claustrum, the spinal column of 33 vertebrae, cerebral spinal fluid, sacrum. Of course, we use a different language of mouth noises to describe the functions of these interacting parts and their dependency on each other. If the ancient masters were as advanced as we are suggesting, they were surely not ignorant of these components, but would illustrate and study the subject of anatomy in a completely different way than us. What if that way of communication was so different from our way of language-based thinking that we interpret their messages completely wrong or even ignore them altogether? And if so, what could we be missing out on learning from these symbolic-oriented communications? This bit of text here that seems to illustrate what we're talking about. If we look at the human being in its core function, we are opted to look at the central nervous system and its interaction with the brain. We know that the two separate hemispheres of the brain act differently from one another, the left side for logical thinking and the right side for creative thinking. Between these two hemispheres are the pituitary gland and pineal gland. The cerebral spinal fluid is charged with an electrical spark due to its saline content that protects and converts nutrients and information to these corresponding parts. This twin fluid of yellow and white secretions travels up and down the 33 vertebrae from the lowest bone in the spine in the sacrum, where it is heated and powered by the sexual organs, and all the way up to the top of the head. This cycle happens every 12 hours. We are discovering today that there are ways to expand our consciousness by treating this process in a delicate and attentive manner, utilizing exercise, diet, and guilt-free states of mind. This mind and body connection can no longer be ignored by medical science, as we have seen the results of the placebo effect and have seen what havoc mental stress can have on our physical form. When the mentioned twin fluids come from the lower sacrum and enter the brain through the sensor claustrum, they lay dormant for 3 days until they enter the pineal gland. Once entering the pineal gland, pending the quality of the treatment we have given this process, the fluid is electromagnetically activated by the calcite microcrystals of the pineal gland, and thus forms a kind of transducer, like a radio antenna. But to pick up on what? But what does not have to be said here is that the above scientific jargon is confusing and often lost from the understanding of the average person like myself. What if this jargon is blocking us from understanding the meaning and truth of this process? After all, we know that in nature there are no accidents. Is there a better way to communicate in a way that we can take heed of and perpetuate the betterment of ourself and therefore all of humanity? Well, if we were to maybe say look at some coincidences between symbols, and it's interesting after reading that and knowing that the travels of Christ lasted 33 years as he died on the cross at the age of 33. This seems familiar to the 33 vertebrae of the spine and the 33 degrees of initiation by the Freemasons, of course represented by a ladder or other form of ascension. Christ was crucified between two thieves. We know that the two hemispheres of the brain steal from each other to create a coherent sense of reality. The white and yellow twin sacred or sacrum spinal fluids, the milk and honey, meet with these 12 cranial nerves and convey information to them. Jesus taught 12 disciples, and the connections dealing with the number 12, divisible by 3, can be found in more places than can be mentioned here. From the zodiac to how we construct time according to months and hours on a clock, Christ is said to have died for 3 days and was resurrected to ascend into heaven with the promise of returning. This is oddly familiar to the functions of the activity of the pituitary gland and the pineal glands after the secretion is raised up through the spine, or Jacob's ladder, symbolically speaking, within our bodies, which have a similar shape to the symbol of the cross. When we observe the parallel set of stories in comparison to the scientific jargon and then look at the message of Christ as a loving and joyful giver of gifts, we can sort of piece together a message being sent from very long ago by people who understood the universe within themselves in a way that we have been distracted from daily. This particular symbolical allegory goes back even further, considering how the twin serpents of the Kundalini work to activate higher sentience within human beings. And the coincidences continue on and on. For the sake of brevity here, the science of today seems to leave out the important parts of this biological process. The important part might not be how it works, but how we should treat the process itself in order to come into self-realization or turn lead into gold. Just like any ancient myth, parabolic allegory, or alchemical symbol, we can take what we know from today's science and combine it with the wisdom of image-based thinking of our ancient ancestors. These opposites create a clever and more cohesive picture for us of the hows and whys of both mental expansion and bodily health. The science of today tells us what and where, The metaphors of yesterday's past can tell us the meaning and the purpose of these practices and rites of passage. This is kin to the dueling dance of mind-heart coherence. Science speaks to the mind and myth speaks to the heart. Science tells us how we are alive and myth tells us how to live, why we are alive. To be honest though, I oftentimes feel like the science we are exploring today is just now starting to catch up with the wisdom of the ancient thinking. What they understood goes beyond words, as we have seen here. They spent generation after generation dedicated to the fine-tuning of these practices with little to no external distractions from the goal, or lack of goal, depending on the philosophy, like Zen masters. The unification of these opposing messages can be wed to a better process of developing the human species, up, out, forward, into a better state of mind, and thus into a better world.
I'm calling bullshit. Tell me why anyone needs someone above them and up the ass of puppets. Feel sorry for you. Explain to me why you need someone steering you. What you seek lies within you. Age of information, yet you get your wisdom from celebrities. Cut just like a cookie, molded by the magazines and TV screens. Peasants fight to survive. Your prince doesn't walk with us. There is no king of mine. You. And up the ass of puppets. I took a look around, don't know which way to go. So I watch TV shows, tickets to Super Bowl. I look in magazines, for shit that I don't